They say the desert remembers everything, every footprint, every promise, every meeting that was never supposed to happen. Ethan Caldwell had been riding alone for 3 days when the moment that would become a legend quietly appeared on the horizon. The Mojave stretched for miles in every direction, a wide ocean of sand and stone under a white afternoon sun that hung heavy in the sky. The heat shimmered above the ground like drifting glass, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves pressing into dry earth. Ethan Caldwell had grown used to that silence. A man riding alone across the desert learns quickly that silence is not emptiness. It is a kind of company. His horse moved slowly now, careful across the uneven ground, while the distant mountains rested like dark shadows along the far edge of the world. Ethan kept one hand loosely on the reins and the other resting near his saddle horn, his eyes scanning the endless horizon the way a man does after too many years spent surviving the frontier. Nothing moved out here unless it meant something. The desert was honest that way. Then he saw her. At first she looked like nothing more than a ripple in the heat, a dark shape standing at the top of a low sand ridge nearly a quarter-mile ahead. Ethan narrowed his eyes beneath the brim of his hat and slowed his horse to a walk. The shape did not disappear. It did not move either. It simply stood there against the sky, still as a marker stone left behind by time itself. As he rode closer, the figure slowly took form. A young woman stood on the crest of the dune, her long dark hair stirring gently in the wind. Her dress moved softly with the breeze, its patterns unfamiliar but unmistakably native to the desert tribes that had lived here long before the first wagon wheel ever cut a trail through the sand. She carried no weapon that Ethan could see. No horse waited behind her. No travelers rode nearby. She simply stood there watching him approach, as if she had been waiting for exactly this rider to appear out of the empty horizon. Ethan felt the strange weight of the moment settle quietly in his chest. In a land this wide, meeting another person out here was never an accident. He brought his horse to a stop about 20 yards from the base of the ridge. The wind moved between them, carrying the dry scent of sand and distant sage. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The woman studied him from above with calm dark eyes that seemed older than the desert itself. Then she stepped down the slope, walking lightly across the sand until she stood several paces away. Up close Ethan could see the quiet strength in the way she carried herself, steady, unafraid, as though the desert belonged to her in ways no map could ever explain. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and clear in the afternoon air. "Turn back before sunset." Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her with quiet curiosity rather than alarm. Most men on the frontier would have asked questions immediately. Ethan Caldwell had learned long ago that the desert often answered questions before a man even knew how to ask them. He glanced once toward the glowing western sky, where the sun had already begun its slow descent. Then he looked back at her, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he did not turn his horse around. The woman waited without moving, as though time itself had slowed around her. Ethan Caldwell studied her quietly, the way a man does when he senses that the smallest moment may decide the direction of everything that follows. The desert wind passed gently across the ridge, carrying thin ribbons of sand that drifted along the ground like pale smoke. Somewhere far away a hawk circled in the wide open sky, its shadow sliding slowly across the empty land. Ethan rested his hands loosely on the saddle horn and allowed his horse to breathe and settle beneath him. The animal flicked its ears forward, sensing the quiet tension between the two strangers standing in the middle of nowhere. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, the voice of someone who had spent more time speaking to the land than to people. "I have been riding west for nearly 100 miles. Turning around would make that a long ride for nothing." The young woman watched him with the same steady gaze, her expression neither angry nor welcoming. She seemed to weigh his words in silence, measuring something that had nothing to do with distance or travel. The sun continued its slow descent toward the mountains, casting long golden light across the desert floor. After a moment she spoke again, her tone still calm, but now carrying a quiet seriousness. "This land changes after sunset." Ethan lifted his eyes toward the distant ridges she had come from. The desert looked the same as it always had to him, endless and silent. Yet something in her voice suggested that what she meant had nothing to do with darkness. Ethan removed his hat briefly and wiped the back of his wrist across his brow before placing the hat back on his head. The heat of the afternoon still lingered in the air, though the shadows were slowly stretching longer across the sand. "You are waiting for someone," he said. The young woman shook her head slightly. "No, I am waiting for you to decide if you understand the warning." Ethan could not help but smile faintly at that answer. It had been many years since anyone had spoken to him with that kind of calm certainty. Most people on the frontier raised their voices or reached for their guns when they faced a stranger. This woman did neither. She simply stood there, as calm and steady as the desert itself. Ethan studied her more closely now. Her posture was relaxed but balanced, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime walking this land. Around her neck hung a thin leather cord holding a small silver pendant that caught the last light of the afternoon sun. The pendant glinted for only a moment before settling again against the fabric of her clothing. Something about it stirred a faint memory deep in Ethan's mind, though he could not yet place where he had seen such a thing before. The woman followed his gaze briefly and rested her hand lightly against the pendant as though it carried meaning far older than either of them. Then she looked back up at him and spoke once more. "Riders will reach this place before nightfall." Ethan turned slowly in his saddle and scanned the wide horizon behind him. The desert stretched for miles in every direction, quiet and empty as it had been all afternoon. Yet the woman's voice carried no uncertainty. She spoke as someone who understood the land the way a sailor understands the sea. Ethan looked back at her, the faint smile still touching the corner of his mouth. "Then I suppose I should learn why you are standing here waiting for a man you have never met." The woman did not answer Ethan's question right away. Instead, she turned her eyes toward the distant horizon behind him, the same horizon he had already scanned moments earlier. Ethan followed her gaze again, this time paying closer attention. At first, the desert still looked empty, the same endless stretch of pale sand and scattered stone that had surrounded him for days. But after several seconds, he noticed something different. A thin line of dust floated low against the earth far away, almost invisible in the fading afternoon light. It was faint enough that most travelers would have missed it entirely. The woman spoke quietly without looking back at him. "Riders." Ethan studied the distant dust more carefully now. The line moved slowly, almost lazily, yet it grew slightly wider with every passing moment. Someone was indeed traveling across the desert. From this distance, he could not count the horses, but he could tell there was more than one rider approaching. The desert had a way of revealing movement long before people arrived. Ethan leaned forward slightly in the saddle and narrowed his eyes. Travelers often followed the same natural paths through the desert valleys, and the direction of that dust line told him something important. Whoever those riders were, they were headed directly toward this ridge. Ethan looked back at the woman standing calmly a few yards away. "You knew they were coming before I saw the dust." She nodded once. This land speaks long before the wind carries the dust high enough for strangers to notice. Ethan considered that answer for a moment. He had heard similar things from old scouts and trackers during his younger years, men who had lived their lives reading the ground and the wind the way scholars read books. Yet there was something deeper in the way she said it, as if the desert itself had whispered the warning to her long before he ever rode into sight. The sun had dropped lower now, casting long amber light across the dunes. The temperature had begun to ease slightly as the day moved toward evening, but the air still held the warm breath of the desert. Ethan swung his right leg over the saddle and stepped down onto the sand. Beside his horse, the animal lowered its head and snorted softly, grateful for the pause. Ethan removed his hat again and brushed a small line of dust from the brim before placing it back on his head. Then he looked toward the distant riders once more. "Are they looking for you?" he asked. The woman finally turned to face him fully. Her expression remained calm, yet something thoughtful moved behind her eyes now, as if she were deciding how much truth to share with a stranger who had appeared out of the desert only minutes earlier. "Not for me alone," she said. Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly. The answer carried the kind of quiet mystery that had a way of changing a man's expectations about a situation. The riders were not simply travelers crossing the land. They were coming here for a reason. The woman stepped up beside Ethan and looked toward the distant dust with him. Up close he noticed again the small silver pendant resting against her chest, its polished surface catching the last soft rays of sunlight. The symbol etched into its center was simple, yet unfamiliar, a design of curved lines that seemed older than the frontier towns scattered across the territory. Ethan felt the same strange flicker of memory he had felt earlier, like a distant echo of something he had seen long ago. The woman rested her hand lightly over the pendant as though she had sensed his attention. Then she spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a new weight of meaning. Those riders believe a white cowboy crossed this desert 3 days ago, carrying something that does not belong to him. Ethan slowly turned his head toward her. I crossed this desert 3 days ago, he said quietly. The woman nodded. Yes, that is why I was waiting here when you arrived. The woman's words settled into the quiet air between them, and for a moment the only sound was the wind brushing softly across the sand. Ethan Caldwell did not move right away. He simply stood there beside his horse, looking at her with the calm patience of a man who had spent most of his life learning that the truth often arrived slowly on the frontier. After a few seconds, he turned his eyes back toward the distant line of dust. The riders were closer now, still far away, but close enough that the drifting cloud behind them had grown thicker against the horizon. Ethan rested one hand on the saddle horn and spoke evenly. I am not carrying anything that belongs to anyone. The woman studied him quietly, as if weighing not only his words but the stillness behind them. The desert light softened as the sun moved lower, stretching long shadows across the ground between them. Finally she spoke again. The men riding toward us believe that someone took a sacred object from land that belongs to my people. Ethan glanced down at the sand near his boots, and then back toward the horizon. I have not taken anything from anyone, he repeated. The woman nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. I know. Ethan looked at her again, this time with a trace of curiosity. If you know that, he said, why are they riding here? The woman stepped a few paces along the ridge and looked out across the desert. Because they do not know you the way I do. Ethan could not help but give a faint, thoughtful smile at that. You met me less than 10 minutes ago. The woman returned the smile, though it was small and quiet. Sometimes 10 minutes is enough. The wind lifted a thin ribbon of sand between them before settling again. Ethan followed her gaze toward the distant riders. The dust line had separated now into several moving shapes. From this distance, he could make out the steady rhythm of horses crossing the desert floor. Whoever they were riding with purpose. Ethan looked back at the woman. You said they believe I am carrying something. She nodded once more and lightly touched the silver pendant resting against her chest. Something like this. Ethan's eyes drifted again to the pendant. The shape of the engraved symbol caught the fading sunlight, and for the second time that afternoon a memory stirred faintly in the back of his mind. It was not a clear memory yet, more like a shadow from long ago. He took a slow breath and looked back at her. And you believe I do not have it? Yes, she said. Ethan tilted his head slightly. That seems like a great deal of trust for a stranger. The woman rested her hand over the pendant again and looked at him with quiet certainty. My grandmother taught me how to recognize when someone carries the truth in their voice. Ethan considered that answer carefully. Something about the calm honesty in her tone felt familiar, though he could not say why. The riders were now close enough that he could see the sunlight glinting faintly against metal on their saddles. The desert would not remain quiet for much longer. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the neck of his horse and turned back toward the woman. Then perhaps you should tell me why you were waiting for me before I ever arrived here. The woman looked once more at the pendant, then back at Ethan, and the fading sunlight caught a thoughtful expression in her eyes. Because 3 nights ago, she said softly, the desert wind carried the story of a lone cowboy who crossed this land with a kindness my people have not forgotten. The woman's words lingered in the warm evening air, and Ethan Caldwell felt the faint echo of that strange memory return again, stronger this time, like a distant bell sounding somewhere deep in his past. He watched her carefully, trying to understand how a story carried by the desert wind could possibly be connected to him. The riders in the distance continued to approach, their figures now clearly visible against the pale sand as the sun drifted lower behind the mountains. The desert was beginning to cool, but the quiet tension between the two strangers seemed to warm the space around them. Ethan folded his arms loosely across the saddle horn and spoke in a steady voice. I have done nothing in this desert that should concern a group of riders chasing dust across 20 miles of open land. The woman looked at him calmly, the silver pendant resting motionless against her chest as the wind settled for a moment. 3 nights ago, she said, a young boy from my people became lost in the desert beyond the western canyon. Ethan listened without interrupting. The woman continued slowly, as though each word mattered. The boy was traveling with his family when a sudden storm scattered their horses. By morning the boy had wandered far from the camp. The desert is not gentle with children who walk alone under the sun. Ethan felt something shift in his memory now, the faint outline of a moment he had nearly forgotten. He remembered the dry wind that afternoon, the wide stretch of land west of the canyon, and the small figure he had spotted near a cluster of stone ridges. A boy no older than 10 had been standing alone beside a struggling horse, too tired to continue walking. Ethan had stopped without thinking. Out here, a traveler did not ignore a child in the desert. He had given the boy water from his canteen and lifted him into the saddle while guiding the tired horse toward the nearest shaded wash where the boy's family might search for him. The entire moment had lasted less than an hour before Ethan continued riding east. He had never asked the boy's name, and the boy had spoken only a few quiet words in a language Ethan did not know. Ethan slowly looked back at the woman standing before him now. The desert wind carried the smell of warm dust and distant sage across the ridge. The boy found his family again, she said gently. Ethan nodded once. I am glad to hear it. The woman studied him with quiet warmth in her eyes. My people do not forget kindness given freely in the desert. Ethan shifted his weight slightly and looked once more toward the approaching riders. Their horses were now close enough that he could hear the faint rhythm of hooves traveling across hard ground. Then why are those men riding toward us like they are chasing a thief? He asked calmly. The woman rested her hand against the silver pendant again and turned her eyes toward the riders. Because the boy told them about the man who helped him. Ethan tilted his head slightly. That does not explain the dust cloud behind them. The woman nodded. When the boy returned, he also told them that the man who helped him carried a saddlebag with a symbol they believed belonged to something sacred. Ethan's brow lowered slightly in thought. A saddlebag, he said slowly. The woman met his gaze again. Yes. Ethan reached behind the saddle and lifted the worn leather bag that had traveled with him for years. The faint symbol stamped into the leather had faded with age, but it was still visible if someone looked closely enough. The woman studied it for a moment before speaking softly. That symbol once belonged to a healer from my tribe many years ago. The woman's words settled over the ridge like the final light of the day, quiet but impossible to ignore. Ethan Caldwell turned the worn leather saddlebag slowly in his hands, studying the faded symbol stamped into the corner of the flap. He had carried that bag for nearly 15 years, through deserts, grasslands, and towns scattered across the frontier, yet he had never thought much about the small mark pressed into its leather. To him, it had always been just another piece of gear bought long ago from a trading post in a dusty settlement whose name he barely remembered. Now the symbol seemed different, older, as if it carried a story he had never been told. The woman stepped closer and studied the bag carefully without touching it. The wind shifted gently across the ridge, lifting a few strands of her dark hair while the last sunlight glimmered across the silver pendant resting against her chest. That mark belonged to my grandmother, she said quietly. Ethan looked up from the bag and met her gaze. Your grandmother was a healer, he said slowly, remembering the words she had spoken earlier. The woman nodded once. She was known across many miles of desert. People traveled days to reach her when sickness came to their homes. Ethan turned the bag again in his hands, running his thumb across the worn leather where the faint mark had nearly disappeared from years of dust and weather. I bought this saddlebag in a town north of the canyon many years ago, he said. The trader told me it had belonged to someone who passed through before me. The woman listened closely, her expression thoughtful rather than suspicious. My grandmother gave many things to travelers over the years, she said. Sometimes she gave herbs, sometimes blankets, sometimes tools. But the bags marked with this symbol were special. Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly. Special in what way? The woman rested her hand over the silver pendant and looked toward the distant riders for a moment before answering. They were given only to people who had helped our people when help was needed most. Ethan felt the quiet weight of that sentence settle into the air between them. The riders were closer now, their horses moving steadily across the open desert floor. The fading sunlight stretched long shadows across the sand while the sound of distant hooves slowly grew, clearer against the quiet land. Ethan looked down again at the saddlebag resting in his hands. For years he had carried it without question, using it to hold simple things every traveler needed on the frontier. Water flasks, small tools, dried food, and the occasional letter from a town left behind. He had never imagined it might carry the memory of someone else's kindness. The woman watched him carefully and then spoke again in a softer voice. My grandmother told stories about the people she trusted with those bags. She said they were men and women who helped others even when the desert made survival difficult. Ethan gave a faint, thoughtful smile. Then it seems your riders are chasing the wrong man, he said. The woman's eyes remained calm as she studied him. Perhaps. The wind carried another faint echo of hoofbeats across the sand. Ethan lifted his gaze toward the approaching riders once more, and then back to the woman standing beside him. If that mark belongs to your grandmother, he said quietly, then perhaps this bag was never truly mine to carry. The last light of the sun stretched low across the desert as Ethan Caldwell held the worn saddlebag in his hands, turning it slowly as though the faded symbol might reveal the rest of its story if he looked long enough. The woman stood beside him in silence, watching the horizon where the riders continued their steady approach across the open land. The sound of hooves was clearer now, carried on the cooling evening air that drifted through the canyon. The desert was changing as dusk settled over the sand, the harsh heat of the afternoon fading into the quiet stillness that came before night. Ethan finally lowered the saddlebag and fastened it back onto the saddle. For a moment, he rested his hand on the leather strap, thoughtful. If your grandmother gave these bags only to people she trusted, he said slowly, then the man who carried this before me must have earned it somehow. The woman nodded once. Yes. My grandmother believed that kindness traveled farther than any rider. She said that when someone helped another traveler in the desert itself remembered. Ethan looked out across the fading horizon again. The riders were now close enough that their shapes were no longer lost in dust. Several horses moved together in a loose line, their figures dark against the pale sand as they crossed the valley below the ridge. Ethan could see the steady rhythm of their movement, calm but purposeful. They would reach the ridge soon. He rested one hand on the neck of his horse, feeling the animal's slow breathing beneath his palm. Then he turned his attention back to the woman standing beside him. You said your grandmother told stories about the people she trusted with those bags. The woman studied him carefully before answering. Yes. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Did she ever speak about the man who carried this one before me? The woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached slowly toward the saddlebag and gently turned it so the fading symbol faced the last rays of sunlight. Her fingers hovered above the mark without touching it, as if the symbol itself deserved a certain respect. My grandmother once told a story about a traveler who arrived many years ago during a long drought, she said softly. The people in the desert were struggling that year. Water was scarce, and many families were forced to travel farther each day to find what they needed. Ethan listened without interrupting. The woman continued in the same calm voice. One afternoon, that traveler came across an old healer resting beside the trail. The sun had been strong that day, and the healer had walked too far from her village. The traveler shared his water and stayed beside her until the heat passed. Ethan felt a faint stir of recognition in the story, though the memory still remained just beyond his reach. What happened to the traveler? He asked quietly. The woman's eyes lifted from the saddlebag to meet his. My grandmother said the traveler refused any payment for helping her, so she gave him one of the marked bags instead, she said. Ethan slowly exhaled, the desert wind brushing past his hat as the sound of approaching riders echoed across the valley. Then perhaps that man carried the bag only until someone else needed it more, he said thoughtfully. The woman studied him for a long moment before speaking again. That is exactly what my grandmother believed would happen. The riders reached the base of the ridge just as the last edge of sunlight slipped behind the distant mountains. The desert entered that quiet hour when colors faded into soft shades of gold and blue, and every sound seemed to travel farther across the open land. Ethan Caldwell stood beside his horse while the small group approached at a steady walk, their horses moving calmly as if they had ridden many miles across the desert already. Dust settled slowly behind them as they stopped several yards away. No one spoke immediately. The evening wind moved lightly across the ridge, stirring the edges of coats and saddle blankets. Ethan noticed that the men were watching him carefully, but their attention moved just as often toward the woman standing beside him. She stepped forward slightly, her presence calm and steady in the fading light. For a moment, the entire group simply observed the quiet scene before them: the lone cowboy, the woman from their people, and the open desert stretching endlessly behind them. One of the riders finally spoke in a low voice, asking a question in a language Ethan did not understand. The woman answered calmly, her tone measured and clear. Ethan listened to the rhythm of their exchange without trying to interrupt. The conversation lasted only a short moment, yet something in the posture of the riders began to change. Their shoulders relaxed slightly, and the tension in their horses eased. The woman turned back toward Ethan and gave a small nod before stepping closer to the nearest rider. She gestured toward the saddlebag resting against Ethan's saddle and spoke again in the same steady voice. The rider studied the bag carefully from where he sat, his eyes tracing the faded symbol pressed into the leather. For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he dismounted slowly and stepped forward, stopping a few paces away from Ethan. The man did not reach for the bag or demand anything. Instead, he looked from the symbol on the leather to the silver pendant resting at the woman's chest, and then back again. The woman spoke once more, explaining something quietly that Ethan could not fully understand. But the tone of her voice carried a sense of respect rather than accusation. The rider listened, and then gave a small nod of his own. Ethan lifted the saddlebag from the saddle and held it out carefully so the symbol was visible in the dim evening light. The rider studied it for a long moment before gently placing his hand over his heart in a gesture that needed no translation. The woman stepped beside Ethan and spoke softly in English. "They understand now." Ethan lowered the bag slowly. "Understand what?" The woman's expression carried a quiet warmth as she answered, "That the bag is not stolen. It is traveling exactly the way my grandmother believed it would." Ethan looked from the rider back to the woman, still unsure how a simple saddlebag had become the center of such attention. The rider returned to his horse and spoke quietly to the others. One by one, they turned their horses toward the open desert again. No one demanded the bag. No one questioned Ethan further. They simply prepared to ride away. Ethan watched them for a moment before glancing toward the woman beside him. "That was simpler than I expected," he said quietly. The woman smiled faintly as the riders began moving across the valley again. "My grandmother used to say that when a story reaches the right moment, the desert itself knows when to let it continue." The riders disappeared slowly into the growing blue shadows of the desert, their figures fading across the wide valley until only a faint trail of dust remained drifting above the sand. Ethan Caldwell watched them for a long moment without speaking. The evening had settled fully now, and the desert air carried a cooler breath that moved gently across the ridge. Far above, the first stars had begun to appear against the deepening sky. Ethan rested his hand on the neck of his horse and let out a quiet breath he had not realized he had been holding. For a place that seemed empty, the desert had a way of filling a man's day with unexpected stories. He finally turned his attention back to the woman standing beside him. The silver pendant at her neck caught the faint glow of twilight, reflecting a soft glimmer of light as the wind stirred the edge of her clothing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt different now, no longer tense but thoughtful, as though the desert itself had paused to listen. Ethan glanced toward the saddlebag once more. The faded symbol looked smaller now, almost ordinary again in the dim light, yet he knew the story behind it would never feel ordinary again. "It seems your grandmother had more faith in strangers than most people I have met," Ethan said quietly. The woman smiled faintly and lifted her eyes toward the wide sky. "My grandmother believed that kindness does not belong to one tribe or one town. She believed it belongs to anyone who chooses to carry it forward." Ethan considered those words while the desert settled into its quiet night. Somewhere far away, a coyote called across the valley, its voice drifting through the open land before fading again into the stillness. The woman turned back toward Ethan and studied him for a moment. "You carried the bag for many years without knowing its story," she said. Ethan nodded once. "That is true." The woman looked again toward the path where the riders had disappeared. My grandmother believed that objects like this move from one traveler to another when the time is right. They do not stay with one person forever. Ethan rested his hands on the saddle horn and looked down at the worn leather bag. For years it had been nothing more than a simple part of his gear. Now it felt more like a quiet responsibility. After a moment, he lifted the strap and fastened it securely back against the saddle. I suppose that means one day someone else will carry it, he said thoughtfully. The woman gave a small nod. Perhaps someone who needs it more than you do. Ethan glanced back toward the empty desert road stretching east across the valley. The trail would take him many miles before sunrise if he continued riding tonight. But the quiet conversation on the ridge had slowed his thoughts in a way the desert sometimes did when it wished to remind a traveler that not every journey was measured in miles. He placed his hat firmly on his head and stepped into the saddle once more. His horse shifted patiently beneath him, ready to continue across the open land. Ethan looked down at the woman one last time. "Thank you for explaining the story behind this bag," he said. The woman rested her hand lightly over the pendant and smiled with the calm certainty of someone who understood the desert's long memory. "The story is not finished yet," she said softly. Ethan followed her gaze across the endless horizon where the night had fully arrived. Somewhere out there another traveler would one day need water, shelter, or simple kindness in a place where survival depended on strangers helping strangers. The desert wind moved gently across the ridge as Ethan turned his horse toward the distant trail. Long after his figure disappeared into the wide darkness of the Mojave, people in scattered frontier towns would still tell quiet stories about the evening when a lone cowboy met a woman from the desert and discovered that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can travel farther than any rider ever could.